Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Vangelis, Juno to Jupiter. Okay, Vangelis. This Greek artist is one of the big 70s synth pioneers, albeit one of the less frequently talked about ones. I've gotten lots of requests to talk about him in the past, and have referenced him a number of times, and I think I'm pretty long overdue to do a full video on him talking about his work in depth. I will freely admit that I hadn't listened to any of his work outside of two particularly well-known movie soundtracks to Chariots of Fire and Blade Runner. The latter I know well is one of the most well-acclaimed soundtrack albums of all time, and I do not disagree with its reputation. But I'd never actually heard any of his regular albums before starting work for this video, so of course, I made sure to fix that and do a full catch-up session and listen to all of those, which was pretty much the reason I wanted to do this video in the first place. I will admit that I had to skip over the other soundtrack albums he put out aside from the two I'd already heard, just for the sake of keeping things simpler for myself and not completely overstuffing the video. This guy's put out a lot of albums, and this latest one I'll be actually reviewing will mark as his 19th official non-soundtrack album. If I included all his soundtracks, the count would go up to like 30, and I just don't have time for that. Feel free to bug me about the stuff I've missed. I've heard good stuff about like the Antarctica and 1492 soundtracks. I didn't listen to those though. But this in brief segment is already gonna run on way too long as usual, so may as well get into it. Here's my thoughts on his discography so far, or most of it at least. Alright, so I guess this is considered his solo debut album. He did some stuff under his full name before this, but this is the first Vangelis album, or widely classified as such. And there's actually no synthesizers on it at all. It's kind of more of like a psych rock kind of project using lots of different live instrumentation ranging from ordinary guitars and Hammond organ to tablas and ethnic singers and several different vocal appearances from French singer F.R. David. I guess at this point, this was still kind of a spin-off of the work Vangelis was doing as part of the prog band Aphrodite's Child, and it features a few appearances from his old bandmates from there. But yeah, this is still pretty abstract and ambient-centric stuff at its core, the kind of thing I can't imagine would be difficult to get into for fans of his more famous synth-driven material. It's pretty solid. But this is where the electronic stuff starts, and, this is one of the most over-the-top things I've ever heard in my life. Combining his synth work with ridiculously bombastic orchestral and choir arrangements inspired by the likes of Bach and Beethoven's most famously intense work, even including a guest appearance from John Anderson of Yes. To say this thing is a lot to take in would be the understatement of the year. It makes Tales from Topographic Oceans almost feel like easy listening by comparison. I don't know if this is the kind of thing I see myself putting on regularly as a result. The first 12 minutes or so got especially overbearing for me, but I liked everything else. The ambient segment of part 1 and the John Anderson section deliver some solid atmosphere, and part 2 delivers a lot more creative and experimental ideas that I found myself getting pulled into a lot more. But I feel like this is where Vangelis really pinned down the sound he's best known for. Lots of big, triumphant synth soundscapes centered around a space-themed concept. It's epic, it's sonically varied, compositionally it's excellent, and one of my big favorites from this marathon. That said, the mastering is pretty subpar across the board. Much too treble-heavy and focused on percussion over bass or actually sounding spacious. Also with too many moments where I had to adjust the volume up and down. I tried looking into multiple different editions just in case, and while some were definitely worse than others, they all kind of pale in comparison to something like Oxygen, which came out the same year. Still easily enjoyed this enough to hang on to it and give it my recommendation. It's a very good to great project regardless, but man, this could have been amazing with better engineering. First album that utilizes his famous CS80 synth, and, well, this one's better mastered than the last one, though honestly kind of found it to be a less interesting companion to the previous album. Still pretty dang good. The opener and final track 3+3 are the clear highlights for me, though I was left wishing I was more invested by the rest of it. Okay, now this one's just 40 minutes of very sparse, purely improvised ambient synth compositions without any regard for melody or structure or any of that, often labeled as his avant-garde experimental album. Though I honestly didn't find it as difficult to listen as many have made it out to be. I mean, it's not going to be for everyone, and it does lose steam in its second half for me. But I did think it quite effectively got some spooky atmosphere together and provided just enough variation in texture just through that one synth he used to keep it from getting too one note. Didn't sweep me off my feet, but it's certainly an enjoyable point of interest in his catalog. And how about a whole album combining his usual style with Chinese music, kind of in the same vein as what Jean-Michel Jarre did with the original compositions on his Concerts in China album 2 years later. It's pretty solid stuff. I think I could hang on to it. I have no idea what to even make of this one. I guess parts of it lean towards more like Kraftwerk-esque synth pop, and other parts lean towards jazzy soundtrack material, and there's also a lot more varied, like, vocal appearances all over the place, sung, vocoder, or spoken word, and there's a track called Not a Bit All of It, which sounds like a shitpost. I guess I like the album, but these 6 tracks don't really fit together. I kinda wish a track like, say, Memories of Green would show up on a different album that could sonically support it better. Shame that's never gonna happen, though. Gotta bring this up since it's by far his most widely recognizable work. Even if you don't think you've heard it, you have. If you've seen literally any slow-motion footage of people running, then you know the inspirational piano theme that always runs underneath. The rest of the soundtrack, beyond the main title theme, pretty much sounds exactly what you would expect. Schmaltzy blends of piano and synth that fit a soundtrack to an inspirational movie about Olympic athletes. And however good you think it's going to be is how good it will be. Honestly, this is not an essential listen at this point. I don't think it's particularly survived having been memed to death over many decades. Or, I don't know if it really stood among his best ever work to begin with, but it's nothing objectionable either if you want to give it a shot. Ooh, I really like this one. Lots of very nice, enveloping and well-textured synth ambience here. There's a few cuts with arrangements that would translate perfectly to a full live orchestra, mainly movements 3 and 5, but being played entirely with synths gives them a whole different kind of charm that's much more unique to him. And that 18-minute first movement is one of the best things I've heard from him yet. This one's a keeper. But speaking of albums that combine his analog synth sound with classical and symphonic stylings, this one delves even further down that rabbit hole, and basically creates a full-on symphony combining the synths with a full choir again. Not as off-puttingly over the top as Heaven and Hell was, or maybe I just got used to it at this point, but it's certainly similar in its grand vision and scope, and maybe more soundtrack-like since he was doing a lot of those at the time. It's also quite solid. And here's another album kind of like Boborg that goes for something much more experimental, minimalistic, and structuralist than the usual from him. And I actually prefer this one a little. It has a bit more variety texture-wise. The album having been originally released with the 2 sides mislabeled to be the reverse of each other is kinda weird too, but it's pretty easy to tell which way he originally meant it to be. And his last album of the 80s turned out to be by far the most 80s sounding of them all. Kinda feels like a similar change of pace that Tangerine Dream made around their Underwater Sunlight era towards marginally poppier instrumental cuts, or what Jarre was doing in his Rendezvous period. No longer nearly as timeless as his previous stuff, and falls a bit on the long side, but I still thought it was cool for what it is. I like the flutes. I guess this is a concept album that delivers as much of an urban atmosphere as it advertises, even featuring narration from Roman Polanski about getting a sandwich for breakfast at 2 different points. Okay, like Direct, it does feel particularly dated and 80s-ish, and this one's markedly less well-produced, unfortunately. A lot of less than convincing stock MIDI textures here, but it does basically form the aesthetic and stylistic blueprint that countless Vaporwave albums followed decades later. But if you're looking to get some immersive urban atmosphere, I can think of a better project to pick up. Okay, obviously couldn't very well skip over this one now, could I? The movie came out back in 1982, but this official soundtrack album didn't drop until 1994 for whatever reason. But, yeah, I mean, this is already considered one of the all-time greats, his most well-acclaimed work overall, and quite possibly the best synth soundtrack of all time. And I don't even really know what its competition might be. Like, what, Tron Legacy? Minecraft? Come on. Daft Punk and C418 wish they could have made this. Even if this album obviously had the benefit of me having heard it before, it will probably come to the surprise of absolutely no one that this happened to be my favorite project in this marathon overall, and I pretty much agree with every bit of the hype that it's amassed. A perfect blend of synth ambience and jazz stylings, and some of the greatest mood setting any album I know has pulled off. Also, Memories of Green finally has a much more fitting home. If you only ever listen to one Vangelis album, make it this one. And now we've officially entered into the new age portion of his career. Got an album with a few vocal guests that seem very much aimed to appeal to the Enya crowd. And it actually turned out really solid for what it is. While it's absolutely nothing game-changing, and Ask the Mountains is a clunker with its distractingly thin MIDI instrumentation, the rest happens to be some of the most well-constructed and consistently enjoyable original material he'd put out in quite a while. And now he's delved even further into New Age territory with one of the single most pleasant and inoffensive projects he's ever done. Little to no sense of dramatic weight or stakes, just pure peaceful music evoking the ocean. I mean, this style has basically been a punchline for decades, but I don't know, I thought it was cool for what it was. Production was solid, and the occasional MIDI tones ended up fitting better in this style. Certainly has its own identity in his catalog, if absolutely nothing else. Now, how about a whole modern classical album? Still all played with synths and imitations of orchestral instrumentation with maybe an occasional choir or guest soprano singer. It's certainly a lot more portentous than his last several albums, though if you're looking for something more textured and exciting, this ain't it. Still's kinda sitting close to New Age territory here and feels fitting for the kind of material inspired by centuries-old Greek paintings. Not gonna lie, I found it to be an even less investing listen than Oceanic. I was kinda checked out after Movement 4, and aside from Movement 7 being the album's solitary bombastic percussive moment, and Movement 10 having a lot of nice emotional and dramatic pianos, this thing just kinda dragged for me. I distinctly remember looking at my iPod at the end of Part 8, thinking, oh, that would have been for a satisfactory finish, then seeing the 11-minute Part 9 immediately starting and saying out loud, oh, come on! Album's okay, but it's just not one of his more interesting ones. But now at long last, Vangelis got the chance to compose for a real live orchestra instead of a synth imitation one, and I was a lot more excited for this idea before I heard El Greco. That said, this is a much more investing listen than that project. Not stylistically far away from it, does still drag in parts, and I did get sick of the constantly present soprano singers. But the whole thing is a lot more bombastic on average, with more dynamic and intense percussive cuts, and those moments are always great when they show up. Okay, after 2 albums that focus so hard on the more orchestral side of his sound, and a 15-year hiatus, it is kinda great to see those old synth arrangements back in the mix. Even if it is a mostly orchestral-sounding project as well, it's a much more overtly spacier one and focusing more on the electronic aesthetic of everything. A solid combination of his more recent work with his old synth pioneering days. Not the most attention-grabbing stuff, admittedly. This mostly blended in the background for me, but it's still pretty nice. And finally, an obligatory mention of the piano album he did in 2019 that has both covers of his old work and new material, since that apparently counts as a main album of his. And after going through all his more recent work, I was really afraid he was just going to be playing on MIDI piano and not real piano, and god damn it. I mean, compositionally it has the emotional effect he was going for, but man, does the stock MIDI sounds just cheapen the experience for me. This one's a skip. But that finally brings us to here. Well, I gotta hand it to Vangelis for this. He's made sure not to make the same album twice. All the albums I listened to were their own thing separate from each other, and while quite a few projects could sound similar, he never tried to outright retread his past successes. He's just kept going on like Jean-Michel Jarre has, even if his career's obviously taken in some pretty different territory. Though while we're on the topic of retreads, I was kind of worried about how this latest album was going to sound. Conceptually, it did sound like pretty dang familiar territory to him. Billed as like an electronic classical crossover with a soprano singer featured on a few tracks. He's definitely never done that before. And inspired by the Juno space probe exploring Jupiter, created as a concept album tying those names to the actual Roman gods. And the Greek equivalents too, because of course. My worry was that on paper this kinda sounds like a retread of Mythodea and Rosetta. 2 albums that were also inspired by then ongoing space missions, and the former of which was literally titled by combining the words mythos and ode. So the mythology territory isn't new for him either. Though I suppose this does appear to go more in-depth on the mythology end of it than those others. The song titles do seem to tell like a vague shape of a story, and I suppose the concept itself is a more clever take on it on paper than those other 2 albums. I figured sonically we were just gonna get another MIDI orchestral album, and had my fingers crossed that it'd at least be more interesting and dynamic than his other attempts at this style. The album did have 18 tracks, so maybe that mean he'd have a lot of different ideas for this? I hope. It did apparently get good reviews from fans when it apparently was accidentally made available for purchase from the label for a brief period last year before being taken down and finally officially released on all platforms just the other day. But after actually listening to it myself, well, this was pretty much exactly what I expected to get, though thankfully it was a dynamic and varied enough listen to hold my attention, and more so than his last couple of projects in this vein. I would not say this is like Rosetta Part 2. This album does fall a bit more towards the classical side on average, and also occasionally incorporate some of the new age tones of his 90s work. But I think the balance between, like, electronic and symphonic-leaning compositions is about the same as that album. And like I said, I think this album's actually a noticeable improvement on Rosetta as well. That album, again, it was mostly just background music for me, but Juno to Jupiter had my attention pulled in a lot more consistently. It just felt a bit more striking in the way it went about its pacing and whatnot. It did also trail off in the last third, but I'll still give it points for all the sections that did really work. Okay, while I'm breaking down individual tracks, I will have to first note that the album does hit a bit of a roadblock when we get to the track Zeus Almighty. Getting this big 11-minute meandering symphonic track that never really feels like it goes anywhere and reminds me of the parts of Mythodea and El Greco that drag the most, yet also blends into the other big symphonic arrangements the rest of the album delivers, does kinda tank the pacing for me, and there's not quite enough in the way of big highlights after that point for the album to make a full recovery. For instance, I kinda wish I cared more for the closer In Serenitatem and its peaceful mix of synth voices. While it feels like it makes sense in context, it feels like an ending. It just isn't that interesting a composition to close us out, and it also ends in like 45 seconds of silence, which is kind of weird. I also will admit I'm not huge on the tracks with a soprano singer on it. There are 3 of those, in Juno's Tender Call, Hera/Juno, Queen of the Gods, and Juno's Accomplishments. While the singing is impressive, very good for what it is, and these tracks help give the album more variety without feeling like an overbearing presence on the album as a whole, I don't know, that kind of singing has just never really been my thing. They're not skips, but neither are they sections I especially look forward to. Still, when it comes to the majority of this album, I don't really have a ton to complain about. It may not surprise you to hear, for instance, that I tended to be more of a fan of the more electronic-leaning cuts. I thought Inside Our Perspectives made for a fairly attention-grabbing opener with all its drum machines and lush, new-agey synth patterns, and similar thoughts on the more low-key and spacious mix of Space's Mystery Road. And of course there's plenty of more evocative ambient synth passages too, see all the layers of disparate echoing blips of Juno's Quiet Determination, and its much sparser companion Juno's Echoes, or the way the blipping synth sequences are even worked into more symphonic-leaning arrangements, like on Out in Space and Jupiter's Veil of Clouds, or something like In the Magic of Cosmos, which is a lot less rhythmic, but its triumphant mixes of synths and orchestral sounds is exactly the kind of thing that Vangelis is best known for. Even some of the more purely symphonic arrangements in the early parts of the album kept me pretty well invested, be it more mysterious cuts like Jupiter's Intuition and Juno's Ethereal Breeze, or more bombastic cuts like Juno's Power and Jupiter Rex. Even if they're all being created out of MIDI imitations, and you might be able to tell if you listen closely enough, they're still a lot more convincing than those he's used in the years previous. If you told me that some of these cuts used a live orchestra, I could have believed you. The album even kind of bookends itself with a few cuts focusing on samples from NASA announcers, with the opener Atlas Push and penultimate cut Apo 32, that do add to the spacey effect of everything. Like I said, the album does give you plenty of variety in terms of the sounds it explores, and that does go a long way towards this album being the kind of thing I'd more want to come back to. But aside from that, I don't really have much else to note about Juno to Jupiter. Overall, it's a pretty fun listen, and it's probably the most engaging project to come out of this whole symphonic era of his career. Still don't quite love it. Again, it does kind of become less interesting in its last third. Wouldn't have minded cutting a few tracks out, at least, if they hadn't been directly built in to flow into each other. It's definitely not the hardest 72 minutes to get through, and I can deal with it enough to keep it as is. But it probably didn't absolutely need to be this long. And I suppose the album does focus on a lot of sounds he's explored quite a few times on previous albums with nothing new he's already done. But first of all, I'm not really sure why you'd even expect that, given how many decades this guy's been around. And second of all, I think this does actually effectively work as a refinement of those formulas he'd set with projects like Mythodea and Rosetta, and got them to fit into a more easily accessible and replayable listening experience. And there's no moments here where it felt like the production took any noticeable dip, or like he was just trying to fill time for its own sake either. Obviously, if orchestral music isn't to your taste, then I would give this a skip, but as someone who's always had a soft spot for albums that can mix electronic sounds with symphonic elements, or can at least do it well, I think I could find a place in my life for this. It's solid. Good to see he's still got it after all these years. And I can let this get away with a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.